Hello, welcome to everybody who's joining. My name is Liz David-Barrett. I'm the Director of the Governance and Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Programme. And delighted that you have all joined us today for our GIA seminar with Tihomira Kostova and Pavel Havlicek. We are going to have a presentation from Tihomira for about 20 minutes. Then we will have comments from Pavel, who's our discussant, and then we'll open up the floor to questions and answers. So as they're both speaking, do start to think about what questions you'd like to ask them or comments that you would like to make, and we'll invite those after they've both finished speaking. We are recording today's session just to make everybody aware of that, and we will make the recording available on YouTube quite soon after the session. So just to introduce Tihomira, Tihomira is a senior analyst at the Center for the Study of Democracy, fantastic think tank based in Sofia in Bulgaria. She specializes in strategic corruption and state capture across the Balkans, Central Asia and the Black Sea regions, and brings over a decade of experience in research, training and strategic planning for public sector development. So Tihomira, if you would like to start sharing your screen, I will wait with introducing Pavel until we bring him in as the discussant.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much for this introduction. So before to present our working paper and the main findings, let me say a few words about the project. Our project is entirely focused on illicit financial flows. We are trying to see and define what is the role of the illicit financial flows in strategic corruption and state capture, and based on that to develop more impactful but at the same time practical interventions that could be replicated and applied to global south countries. Our project covers countries from 2 regions, the 6 Western Balkan countries, Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, North Macedonia, and Kosovo, and the 4 Black Sea countries, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Armenia. The focus of this working paper is on sanction evasion, specifically trade-related illicit financial flows. And we expanded the group of countries with 3 additional countries, which we use as a benchmark case studies. These are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkey. We expanded it due to 2 reasons. First of all, because the 3 countries are considered part of the club of global south countries, and second, because they already have established as main trade hubs for sanctioned dual-use goods to Russia. So let me start with presenting the main findings. By applying one of UNCTAD's methods for measuring illicit financial flows, the so-called partner country method, we have estimated that the illicit financial flows linked to trade in all 10 countries, which I mentioned from both regions, have increased significantly after 2022. Let me explain. The partner country method is actually comparing the reported export and import data of each country to the reported export and import data from the partner country. So it's a kind of a trade mirror statistics, and it is measuring illicit financial flows mainly from trade misinvoicing. So in 2023, notice that these illicit financial flows have increased sharply and reached 31 billion, which is twice of the pre-war levels. On the next slide, we see that this is very valid also for the illicit financial outflows and inflows. We see on the graph on left that Ukraine, Kosovo, and Armenia are the countries which registered the highest illicit financial outflows between 2022 and 2023, which means money leaving the country, while many more countries like Georgia, Moldova, again Ukraine, but also Bosnia, Serbia, and Albania have registered the highest illicit financial inflows or money entering the country. What we observe is that these increases overlap with intensified sanctions against Russia between 2022 and 2023. In order to see whether and how these increases are related to the sanctions, we formulated and tested 2 hypotheses. With the first hypothesis, we wanted to examine whether the increase in the EU exports of sanctioned dual-use goods to our countries led to evasion of the trade-related sanctions against Russia. And by dual-use goods, we mean specific dual-use goods are specific type of goods and specific type of products and technologies which could be applied for both civilian and military purposes. They range from a different, from navigation system to electronics and of machinery which could be applied in hypothesis to our 10 countries, but we expanded to the benchmark countries also. And we then formulated a second hypothesis, which we're trying to see whether there is a link, positive link, correlation between the increases of the illicit financial inflows which we observe in our countries and the increased exports of dual-use goods, specifically to Russia. This hypothesis, the second hypothesis, was applied only to our 10 countries. And we use a simple correlation analysis to test it. Why trade and why trade with sanctioned dual-use goods? First, so the both hypotheses were formulated because we consider the enormous influence which Russia has over these countries. Despite all efforts to maintain close ties with EU, all of the countries are still heavily dependent on Russia for critical resources like fertilizers and depend on energy. For example, Bosnia and Serbia rely on Russia for nearly 100% of their gas needs. Also, Russia managed to maintain steady negative trade deficit with all countries over the last decade for more than 10 years, which of course we started observing, which after 2022 we observed it started declining. However, in 2023, Armenia, Georgia, Serbia still have negative trade deficit with Russia, and to a certain extent Moldova and Bosnia and Herzegovina. All of the countries from both regions are still let's say, very vulnerable and exposed to Russia. Russia's regularly weaponizing different tools and strategies to pressure their governments and societies. It's weaponizing energy. A recent example is the crisis in Moldova from January 2025. We can say that trade with Russia is a huge risk, and this vulnerability has been exacerbated by the growing demand of Russia for sanctioned goods after 2022, but also by some other additional factors like the illicit networks which exist in these countries. We noticed that in all countries from Balkans and Black Sea region, there are already well-established and active trade networks, illicit trade networks, especially for drugs and arms trafficking, which are facilitating the evasion of sanctions and facilitating the trade with sanctioned goods. Of course, additional vulnerabilities are the governance deficiencies manifested mainly with the lack of regulatory capacity and weak oversight from public institutions. And of course, the poor alignment of these countries with EU restrictive measures, and by EU restrictive measures, we mean sanctions. And let's say that this is just exacerbating the overall vulnerability of these countries and exposure to Russia. On the next slide, we see the trade between EU and Russia specifically for sanctioned dual-use goods before and after the war. We know that EU used to be among the critical suppliers of this type of goods to Russia before the war. And we see that until 2021, there was a steady growth and export of this type of sensitive goods to Russia, which decreased sharply in 2022 and almost stopped in 2023. In the meantime, we started observing sudden increases in exports of this type of goods, dual-use goods, to other countries, including our target countries, which means that this export did not disappear. Actually, it was replaced through third countries. And we estimated that in 2024, the imported dual-use goods from all countries in Western Balkans, the 4 Black Sea countries, and the 5 Central Asian countries reached nearly 94% of the EU pre-war exports of dual-use goods to Russia in 2021, which is suggesting a strong sanction evasion and actually confirming that a major part of this export to Russia before the war is replaced through third countries. On the next slide, we see that on the individual basis, all countries have increased their imports from EU of dual-use goods, with Kyrgyzstan, Montenegro, and Armenia leading in this effort. As regards the export of this type of goods, of these sensitive goods to Russia, we observe increases in a lot of countries, but let's say the Armenia and Serbia are the countries with the highest value of traded goods. What is interesting is that we observe certain increases in the exports of dual-use goods to Russia before 2021 for Georgia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro, if I remember correctly. But these increases are, let's say, nominal in comparison to what we see in Armenia and Serbia after 2022. And finally, the statistical analysis which we applied, it revealed and confirmed that Armenia, the imports of Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan of dual-use goods from EU are closely mirroring their exports of the same type of goods to Russia. We, of course, observe different supply-demand dynamics in the 3 countries. I will stop on this on the next slide. For Serbia, it's interesting that we noticed occasional overlaps between their imports and exports, but they're less frequent and pronounced than in other countries. And as regards the remaining countries, the statistical analysis did not confirm a strong link between their imported volume of dual-use goods and exported values of dual-use goods to Russia. However, it is we need to mention that we found cases for sanction evasion, specifically evasion of trade sanctions and trade with dual-use goods in almost all countries. So they're not exception from this practice. Yeah, and this slide shows the difference in the supply-demand dynamics in the 3 countries. We see that in Armenia, the elasticity of the link is stronger than in other countries. For every $1 increase in EU exports of dual-use goods to Armenia, Armenian exports to Russia increased significantly, twice by $2.58. However, in Kazakhstan has the fastest adjustments on the supply-demand dynamics within weeks, but the connection is less intensive than in Armenia. For every $1 increase in EU exports of dual-use goods, Kazakhstan increased its exports to Russia with $0.89. And in Kyrgyzstan has the slower adjustments within 1 or 2 months, and of course the link is less intensive than in Kazakhstan and Armenia. And here's the place to mention that in our still unpublished academic article, we are focusing more on this supply-demand differences and trying to examine more in detail what are the reasons and factors behind them. As regards the second hypothesis, we tested it, but found a general positive link between the illicit financial inflows we observe and the increases in the exports. But when we remove one or another country, for example, Ukraine, this link became very weak. Therefore, there is a need to test again this hypothesis with a broader set of independent and control variables. And see if it exists. Regarding the main evasion tactics and channels, we identify three main strategies which are often used in combination. The first one is the corporate disguise. It's mainly rebranding, changing names of companies, or relocating operations in third countries, establishing subsidiaries in third countries specifically to export sanctioned dual-use goods, using shell and fund companies to obfuscate the true end user of the goods. Trade diversion, mainly through direct or indirect re-export, and of course fictitious transit. The difference between direct and indirect export is that in the direct re-export, the goods are sold to a third country and then they immediately ship to Russia, while in the indirect re-export, there is an intermediary, a proxy buyer, who resells them abroad, and then from this third or fourth country, they reach Russia. And very often in combination, we use the trade intermediaries are using falsifying documents, mainly mislabeling different goods. How is happening? One sanctioned dual-use good is declared a non-sanctioned dual-use goods, or certificates of origin are faked. Shipments are very often split and disguised. Different type of tactics are used to obfuscate and fake the documents and customs documentation. And finally, in the last two slides, I try to summarize the main policy recommendations, but I will try to summarize them, to outline them now. So first, we think a key recommendation is to strengthen the enforcement of sanctions at EU level. We know that although the sanctions are adopted at central level, their enforcement is left to each member state. Currently, there are more than 100 national competent authorities in all member states, and the enforcement of the sanctions is very fragmented and inconsistent. Therefore, there is a need for maybe a more centralized body tasked with the enforcement of the sanctions. And another thing is expanding the mandate of the European Public Prosecutor Office to investigate and prosecute sanctions specifically across the European Union. Because currently the investigations also left with the member states, and each member state is deciding whether the sanction evasion should be classified as administrative or criminal violation. They're operating under different legal and administrative traditions. This is only hindering the effectiveness of the enforcement of the sanctions. The second recommendation is related to improving the economic security and strategic autonomy of the Union by decoupling from Russia, diversifying trade and energy, focusing more on the democratic investments, on foreign investments from democratic market economies, improving also the monitoring and early warning at EU level, but also on regional level, trying to identify sanction evasion hubs within, but also outside the European Union, integrating in a better way the monitoring of sanctions evasion risks in sanctions unit, and allocating more resources to sanctions units in terms of financial, human resources, and technical. And also, to improve the monitoring, it's a good idea for sanctions unit to apply and integrate different tools and methodologies. One methodology is the partner country method that could be applied to measure the illicit financial flows. Of course, it's extremely difficult to accurately measure the illicit financial flows, but the method could be used to red flag high spikes in trade with dual-use goods, or to red flag increases and decreases, and when applied in combination with other tools, could be very useful. And of course, the EU must strengthen its engagement with the Western Balkan and Black Sea countries by providing them with a clear accession timeline, helping them to decouple from Russia and diversify their trade and energy. And the last thing, like the last policy recommendation, is focus on the global initiatives. We definitely need more advanced global initiatives, and we recommend to keep the global initiative focused on the long-term objectives related to democratization and rule of law instead of short-term crises like refugee crises or sudden increases of defense expenditures. Also, there's a need to integrate in a better way the illicit financial flows and state capture monitoring procedures, build the capacity of different institutions, especially financial institutions, to tackle illicit financial flows, and spot risky deals, boost and use more effectively foreign investments from democratic market economies, like I said, and of course pressure offshore financial hubs to block financial flows from sanctioned entities and individuals to prevent the entering of illicit capital in these countries. And I think I kept the time. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Tihomira. Excellent timekeeping and fascinating research. So we're going now to hear from Pavel Havlicek. Pavel is a research fellow at the Association for International Affairs in Prague in the Czech Republic, and he focuses on Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, Russia, and the Eastern Partnership. Overall, his work covers security, disinformation, strategic communication, and also support for democratization and civil society in Central and Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet region. So Pavel is going to give us his sort of initial comments and thoughts on the paper for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open up to Q&A. We've got a couple of questions in the chat already. Feel free to add more, and we'll get to those as soon as Pavel finishes speaking. So Pavel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's a great pleasure here being here with you, actually. And first of all, let me say big words of thanks and congratulations to Tihomira and also Martin, who have done some splendid job, actually. I very much enjoy reading through the report, but also listening to your presentation, Tihomira. I think it's really an interesting case study that we actually have somehow been missing in terms of going deeper in the illicit funding schemes, and then also, of course, bypassing of the sanctions, which has been a topic for quite some time. But of course, we need to go much, much deeper. And I think by offering this kind of model that I really enjoyed studying a little more about and proposing this methodology, I think it's really an interesting deep dive and the first pilot of the study into this area. So I really enjoy this, and I think you are really focusing on the right things at the right time. I mean, especially prioritizing the logic of dual use goods exports, and also having at the variety of countries from both of the regions, key regions for the goods to access to reach Russia, both the Western Balkans, but especially that I follow very closely, and this is the region of South Caucasus, Armenia and Georgia in particular, to much less degree than Azerbaijan. But that's really, really something really well chosen. I really enjoyed looking at the statistics that you provided, also relating to Central Asia. I think we have all seen the enormous increases of trade sort of balances in between individual countries, and especially the ones in Central Asia, namely Kyrgyzstan, but also Kazakhstan and to some degree Uzbekistan. But of course, we see that by hundreds of percentage points, we see that there was something wrong. And I think you are providing us with some very useful answers about what it is and what it does actually when it comes to the sensitive goods, because I think by and we are nearly, unfortunately, entering the fourth year of the full-scale Russian aggression against Ukraine, and we somehow realized already that we will not be able to stop all goods reaching Russia, but at least the sensitive type of those, and especially the dual-use goods, that is actually where, especially the Czech side has been putting emphasis, and the EU as such, of course, they're putting a lot of emphasis on preventing this to happen. So I think we are really providing us with a very useful picture, very useful framework, looking at the right issues and also the right countries in terms of those being the perpetrators of the subversion and bypassing of the sanctions. So when following this logic, and we actually have been coming back to this with Martin for many years already now, when it comes to the loopholes logic. We're looking at the loopholes, what we are missing, what we are not really seeing, what we have not been addressing. This is definitely one of the very important ones. With Martin, we keep coming back to the topic of energy and all those schemes, and I've seen some quite interesting developments, and it will be interesting to hear from you colleagues actually about the impacts of the most recent US sanctions on energy companies, especially Lukoil, which has also this connection to Bulgaria. But it is not just that loophole. It is also that it is the third-party countries. We know that the EU has been trying to address this. David O'Sullivan visiting these countries individually, but of course with only limited success, as you are very rightly confirming and showing us in data. So I think we exactly need this kind of evidence-based type of reports, evidence-based sort of impulses into the EU machine, EU decision-making process, and now really the action needs to be taken in relations to these countries. We know that especially for some of those, and you mentioned, of course, Ukraine, you mentioned Armenia, which is in a delicate but also interesting situation, turning towards the West, but of course being still potentially easy to blackmail. Same as you rightly pointed out, applies to Western Balkan countries, especially in the energy realm. You very much rightly again pointed to Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also Serbia, very much dependent on the energy supplies from Russia. And those are the weak links and the vulnerabilities that these countries are then basically, just following or responding to when it comes to also letting some things to happen that are not necessarily aligned with EU foreign security policy making, but of course to pay back somehow to the patron and the sponsor of some of those countries, especially nowadays, and this is more and more visible in Georgia. They need to pay back to some degree. So I think this is really something that you very rightly pointed out. What was also really interesting for me was, of course, the final recommendation section, and I already pointed in the chat function our own recent study that we actually helped to showcase also during Martin's recent visit to Prague during Forum 2000s when he did very good presentation, and we also tried to contribute with our own report covering these kind of issues. And I think Tihomira, you really pointed, both of you and Martin, you really pointed in the right direction, put the right things on the spot when it comes to recommendations on what needs to change. We had also back in Prague when we had Martin with us, we had a representative of EEPO and the head of the institution, and we are here with us in Prague. And exactly, this is really where we need to do much more in terms of the enforcement of existing rules and procedures on the side of the EU. Yet another example that you pointed out is the capacity of the institutions, both at the EU but also national level. And I'm very glad that you mentioned also the situation of customs, which is really not easy, I have to say, especially in the countries that are bordering Russia. They are facing multiple challenges, and that's why. And this is one of the small victories that we have seen recently, and that was proposed by the Czech Custom Office, and that is the so-called catch-all principle that can actually be expanding actually the existing rules and limits of what can be controlled, to what degree it can be controlled, especially for the reason that you again mentioned, Tihomira, for really different kinds of codes, attributed to different commodities, this being very much played by Russia very skillfully. So even in our own context of the EU countries, we don't have to even go as far as you mentioned regarding the third-party countries. But here, once again, we have our own problems in the EU. But I'm very happy that we also not only speak about ourselves in the EU, where the issues are more or less clear, to implement the EU legislation, to expand the capacities of institutions, but also, of course, increase much more the export control mechanisms. This is also what our paper has been dealing with. But of course, we need to be looking and showcasing the other actors, because we are not living in a vacuum. The trade between Western countries and Russia has not stopped. Our colleague Jiří Skuhrovec of DataLab, which is one of the data-driven organizations, have been describing exactly what you mentioned, in different tactics and techniques that have been used to really label different products and commodities differently, to send them through third-party entities, to really do everything possible just to allow this inflow of goods into Russia still. And this is both the case of third parties, but also different entities related to tax havens and so on and so forth. And we know how difficult it is actually to trace some of these objects, commodities, but also different products, especially the ones that you described as sensitive, the dual use goods. And here, of course, we have a huge gaps in our system, and that's why I'm very happy, and we fully subscribe to enhancing the mandate of European Public Prosecutor's Office, which has been doing some incredible work. We discussed in Prague actually about new schemes being discovered every day, and not always the national authorities being really the most responsible, the most corresponding, the most welcoming, to share information, to actually sort of break these different chains of supply chains and illicit schemes, including smuggling, including organized crime that is also involved in this. But what I really enjoyed about your study is that you really put facts on the ground when it comes to responsibility of the individual countries. So no matter if it is the state, no matter if it is a non-state entity, here the responsibility clearly lies with the individual countries. And this is a very useful material that I'm convinced that EU delegations in the given countries, but also European External Action Service, the European Commission and other bodies, including at the national level, can be using as a proof that things are not necessarily improving, but in many respects worsening, and also these countries making money on that. And once again, I would like to come back to the example of Armenia, which is a country that has been for quite some time already trying to turn west. I participated at the beginning of October in one common workshop in which there were attempts made to make a way for closer cooperation between Armenia and NATO, including in the participation of Turkey. This is also ongoing. There is a lot of rapprochement, but at the same time, we see that the country is full of problems, full of vulnerabilities. You described some of them very well. The presence of Russian soldiers on the ground in some of these countries, the presence of Russian commercial interests in these countries, and also capture of part of their critical infrastructure is indeed something that also needs to be considered. And for us to understand where the countries are, how we can help them. I understood when discussing with high-level representatives of European External Action Service that this is exactly where the service is now looking what it is looking at, to find some of these vulnerabilities and how individual countries can be blackmailed, how they can be actually sort of how they are vulnerable, especially to Russian pressure, and how the EU potentially can help counterbalance this, when providing financial services, investment, infrastructure development, and so on and so forth. So that these countries would not be available and open for this kind of blackmail by Russia. And here, I think you very nicely listed not only those countries by names, but also exposing their vulnerabilities and the matters that we need to be dealing with in order to prevent these illicit schemes from continuation, and of course them becoming much closer to us when it comes to what really matters. And this is, among other things, also the sanction policy and prevention of these illicit and illegitimate flows of money, sensitive goods, of dual use quality, but also of many, many other instances, including energy and other commodities and things that we just cannot simply let go and continue operating because they simply benefit the Russian war economy. And by no means we cannot allow Russia to continue in this state. We need to put more pressure, as it was clearly illustrated just last week with the 19th package of sanctions, the US continued pressure, and the energy dimension of the whole exercise. We really need to put much more pressure, and this by this report, by your efforts, and once again congratulate you on this. You really pointed a finger at the right direction and at the right sort of framework that we need to be considering. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Thanks for drawing out. I think this is a great example of how geopolitics, state capture, corruption, and organized crime all meet, and how very difficult it is to come up with policy recommendations that can really take into account the sort of difficult, those difficult underlying drivers. Fantastic. We've got about 20 minutes left for questions. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand, and we will come to you, or if you would prefer, you can write it in the chat. We've got a couple of questions in the chat already, but I don't know if those people would like to come and introduce themselves and speak their questions. So Basir Rayet, would you like to just take the microphone, briefly introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hello, Basir Rayet, joining from Istanbul, crisis management expert and foresight practitioner. My involvement in sanctions has been as part of the initial sanctions regime on Russia before the 2014 invasion, but also most recently in Gazprom, which was an impromptu advisory on the risks associated with their futures trading, led to United States taking action within 6 hours to 12 hours and issuing, that was during Biden administration. So I would rather have you, Dr. Dave Bennett, select the questions because I have too many, and then leave round for more speakers. Thank you.
Okay, right. Well, you've asked a number of questions. I think where exactly to pick. Perhaps we could talk about this aspect of the sanctions evasion also being a violation of border security. And Pavel talked about this a little bit as well in terms of the role of customs and vulnerability of customs organizations and authorities. I wonder if either Tihomira or Pavel would like to add anything on that. And then quite a lot of the other points you've raised, Basir, are around the role of the EU, the role of Europol. Again, we've sort of discussed some of that in Tihomira's recommendations and Pavel's response. I guess the thing I would add there is perhaps around thinking about that specific recommendation about the European Public Prosecutor's Office, whether we think that that is a sort of viable measure to get them to expand their scope and to look into this more broadly.
Also, NATO is conducting extensive border security and Eastern Sentry and several civil military cooperation, and NATO civil military cooperation should also be incorporated in your work, perhaps at initial introductions and consultations. And this summer, I had the chance to see Frontex carry out jointly border security with the Bulgarian border police and customs. And it's truly something that should be applauded. because are always certain cultural things and certain filters, and they have the threats that German border police is facing is much different from the Bulgarians, perhaps. So in that regards, it creates a very strong team and very effective enforcement and scrutiny and border integrity. Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, so let's go back to Tihomir and Pavel. Customs and EPPO. Anything more to add on how to make those more effective?
Yeah, maybe I can start. Yes, I definitely think we need to focus on building the capacity of the customs union to tackle some of this trade. Customs are a quite important, critical institution, and this trade we do is good. But also, besides the expanding the mandate of the European Public Prosecutor, we need to focus at EU level also centralizing more the enforcement of the sanctions, and maybe having a more centralized body instead of delegating to each member state to enforce themselves the sanctions. This will improve the harmonization and the enforcement, and it will close the loopholes which exist now and actually prevent tackling this major issue, trade with sanctioned dual-use goods. And then it's quite critical also to support developing countries, especially EU candidates countries, through the existing already funding instruments and programs of EU, how to decouple their trade and energy, but also how to build their resistance and democracies.
Yeah, there's underlying dependencies are clearly.
And we can use the existing tools and especially the funding which exists within EU to help them overcome some of these governance issues.
Okay, thanks, Tihomir. Pavel, anything to add on those two issues?
Thank you so much, Liz. So really, let me first of all subscribe to what Tihomir already mentioned. I think this is really where we need to be focusing. In our report, we actually outline, and this is an official information for quite some time, that it is more than 160 institutions around the EU that have been involved in sanction implementation. This is by no means sustainable. We cannot have the system being that fragmented, both nationally and also at the EU level. Just in our own context in Czechia, it is close to 10 institutions involved in a different sort of ways to implement sanctions, from the central bank to customs, to the financial analytical unit, to the Ministry of Industry and Trade, to MFA, which is on its own coordinating the whole system, and so on and so forth. You have the law enforcement as well involved in this. So there is really way too many, of these institutions, and that is why it is so important to really have one place where to go, and EPPO is in definitely a very good position, to have a look at this enforcement, to an implementation, to really fight with the crime that is there actually, the criminal act, in the whole affair. So definitely expanding of the existing mandate, but also really clearly outlining, that this is the leading institution, the one that we should be looking at, in terms of the very complex, ecosystem that we are seeing. This is really where we need to be focusing. This is really where we need to put emphasis on this. And finally, I just want to also come back to the words of Basir and mention about the cross-border. And we really need to come back to the very basics of geography. Countries that are, at the sort of in the eastern flank, especially, in our case, going all the way from Finland down to Bulgaria. These are countries that are really in much more difficult situation, where the physical also transport is taking place. It's not only the ports and harbors and airports, but it is the very physical way of transporting goods and different commodities, and this is where the everyday contact, happens. And we were dealing with this just last year, when it's really hard for people on the ground, to differentiate between, for example, different kinds of steel. How possibly, you can spot a steel of one quality with one coat, and differentiate from another one of a different coat, where when one is sanctioned and the other one is okay to go. It's this everyday management which is really challenging, and I'm very glad to hear from you, Basir, that the situation is becoming a little better with involvement of both NATO, but also maybe the Europol officers, but I am almost certain that the problem has not disappeared. And having a look at the porous external borders, of the EU and the sort of variety of situations and instances where we can call them smugglers, we can call them by other names, but they're traveling from one spot to another, trying always, even between countries, traveling from Estonia to Latvia. If that doesn't work, they go further to Lithuania and so on and so forth, waiting for the moment when they just are somehow, okay to go, So that's actually something that we really need to spend much more attention, expanding the capacity, but also, of course, harmonizing and simplifying the rules, because if we keep them so complex and so complicated, it's very hard to enforce that in the everyday practice. So that's also where we need to be looking. Thank you so much.
Thank you both very much for those comments. So I've got a couple more questions in the chat. I'm going to come to Vera and Paul in a moment to ask if they would like to ask their questions on screen. But anybody else, do please raise your hand if you've got any questions or you would like to just make a comment. It's a great opportunity here to hear from our experts. But for now, Vera Ivanova. Vera, would you like to come on screen, briefly introduce yourself and ask your question?
Hello.
Hi, go ahead.
I'm an intern at the CSD. My question is about AI tools, if they could be used by EU authorities and EU countries to detect more easily, more quickly the infringements. And also, I would like to comment and if it is possible, not only sanctions, but also to use positive encouragement, positive tools encouragement for these countries not to violate sanctions.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And Paul, would you like to come on screen, Paul?
Yeah, hi, thanks very much. So I think this is really terrific and important research. So congratulations to everybody who's been involved. And this question, in a sense, is slightly unfair because you've been researching what you are researching, and my question is about something different but related. But it is a question about sanctions are a standard mechanism in order to try to enforce political ends, and they've been used historically over a very long period. And I'm just wondering whether, if we looked at other cases, South Africa might be a very, very obvious one to look at, has there always been a capacity to use, all of these, I guess, tricks or whatever, evasion tactics to get around sanctions, which of course undermines the whole point and purpose of sanctions? Or is it that in this case, because of the specific regional power of Russia, that it makes a difference? And because, the answer may be that you've just no idea because you haven't looked at it, but I'm just, out of curiosity, is this something that's reflective of, a fundamental problem with sanctions as an approach to trying to achieve other ends?
Excellent. Thanks very much. Great questions again. So first to Tihomira.
Okay, so regarding the AI, yes, of course, absolutely. AI mechanisms and tools could be applied by public institutions to detect risks related to illicit financial flows and sanction evasion. There are different tools that could be applied. Even the partner country method could be applied in advance through AI. And I think this is a very good idea and should be adopted by public institutions and sanctions unit, definitely. And regarding poll questions, theoretically, what I have researched and found is that trade sanctions are less effective than financial and travel sanctions and bans, and they're more easily to be evaded. So the evasion is not because of the Russian dominance, but it's trade sanction evasion is happening also in other countries. especially because the profit incentive exists for third parties, intermediaries, and this is a huge incentive that's allowed this evasion to happen and to be very sustainable, actually, in all countries.
Okay, thanks very much. And Pavel, anything to add on those?
Thank you so much, Liz. I think there was yet another question from the CUT colleague, and this was about the positive motivation of countries. So indeed, this exists. And I think partially the EU has tried this on expanding the opportunities for trade, but also other ways of cooperation. In cases where things would really be moving on the side of sanction implementation, we know that these kind of positive proposals were articulated to many countries in the region. Among those, also the ones that the report is covering, very much applicable for the Central Asian countries, but also South Caucasus and to some degree also Western Balkans, which is probably the closest. Many countries also already on the enlargement track, acceding to the EU. So that's actually also a different situation and more leverage that the EU can be applying, both in positive and also essentially negative sentiment. So that's actually something that where we really can act even more substantially. But as the report once again showed, we are not quite there yet. There is still a lot to be achieved. Even by countries that are trying to demonstrate that they are very much on this pro-EU course, trying to invest in the future steps, aligning them with the European Union, but also the NATO framework. So there is still a lot to do, and I'm very happy to see this evidence on paper, as mentioned previously. And also to Paul's question, actually, it's really interesting what you reminded us of. But I have to say that the landscape, I would say, very much changed, from the times of South Africa and apartheid and all the response to it. There is both more complex environment that Tihomira referred to, but also much more complex response. I don't want to sort of give a wrong figure, but if I remember correctly, there is probably like 12 or 16 different sanction regimes applied now against Russia. It is not only the sort of territorial sanctions that are specifically applied on Russia, but these are also sectoral sanctions that are, sort of narrow down to the Russian example, but has much broader global implications. These are sanctions in human rights areas, democracy, and rule of law. The most recent regime that was introduced by the EU just last year, in the response of what has Russia done to Moldova in the area of hybrid threats. That is the most recent example of how much more complex is our response to when compared with many decades ago that you referred to. So there is both a much more complex environment, state, non-state, third-party entities, globalized world, globalized trade relationships, but also so many new ways, with cryptocurrencies and so many other things, that we also should not forget about. But there is also an attempt to expand, to do much more, and to really respond with much more profound sort of answers to these complex challenges. So there is also something that we can be proud and we can be positive about in that regard.
That's great. Thank you very much, both of you. We've come to the end of the session, so I'd just like to say a big thank you to you both. It's great research, Tihomira and colleagues, and it was great to have you, Pavel, to share your reflections on it as well. Do have a look at the actual publication, which will be released later today. There are some links to it in the chat. I think Pavel has also linked to some of his institute's work on this, and also please do subscribe to our GIACE newsletter. There's a link to that going into the chat as well. We hope to see you at our next GIACE seminar on the 13th of November. Remember, it's Corruption in Paradise, so looking at real estate money laundering in the Global South. That should be a great session too. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.